The second week of March 2020 was a pivotal time for all of us. It's when the COVID-19 pandemic really took hold around the world, changing life as we know it for a very long time, if not permanently. One industry that was particularly hard hit by the pandemic was the airline and aviation industry, as governments shut down their borders, travelers canceled their journeys, and global travel in general ground to a halt. And one of the biggest stories to emerge from that crisis in the meantime centers around the very questionable behavior of our airlines here in Canada. This is the story of Canada's airlines acting with impunity against the interest of passengers and without regard to their obligations under the law. This is the story of a government agency that has turned its back on Canadians when they needed them the most. This is the story of what has become, here in Canada, a full-fledged battle for refunds on cancelled flights. March 13th, 2020. The coronavirus pandemic is quickly becoming a frightening new reality all around the world, including here in Canada. In an attempt to limit the spread of the virus, this is the day that the Government of Canada issued an official global travel advisory to avoid non-essential travel abroad. 3 days later, on March 16th, Canada went one step further and closed its borders to most international travelers until further notice. The message was clear. Now is not the time to fly or travel anywhere. It's time to stay home and slow the spread. Now, this is of course the cue for many Canadian travelers to change or cancel their plans. Most likely cancel because there's really no telling when it'll be safe to travel again. And as this is happening, with virtually no demand for scheduled flights over the next few months, airlines around the world, including our airlines here in Canada, begin canceling the majority of their flights and in some cases even suspending operations entirely for the next few months. Now, during the first few days of this very uncertain and very rapidly unfolding situation, the airlines went ahead as usual and issued full refunds to customers who could no longer travel. Whether the customer themselves decided to cancel due to the government advisory or because the airline had already gone ahead and canceled their flight because it wouldn't make financial sense to keep operating that flight. In either case, the airlines went ahead and issued refunds, and they even proudly advertised this fact on their websites. But then, a few days later, the Canadian Airlines changed their tune as a collective and began the troubling practice of no longer issuing refunds on cancelled flights, even in cases when it was the airline themselves who had cancelled the flight. Instead, the airlines would only offer a travel credit that could be used towards the cost of a future flight with the airline with a 24-month or 2-year validity period. Now, from the consumer standpoint, this is a very problematic practice for a number of reasons. First, the airlines were clearly backtracking on their existing policies, which is never a good look. Second, the 24-month travel credit was extremely restrictive, as you could only use it towards booking a future trip for the same passenger. That future trip could end up being significantly more expensive in the future, in which case the travel credit would not cover the fare difference. Or it could end up being cheaper in the future, in which case the surplus on the travel credit would go to waste. And furthermore, what if the passenger didn't even want to travel over the next 24 months? What with a whole global pandemic going on? Too bad, said the airlines. It was take it or leave it. And that's just not good enough for passengers, most of whom simply wanted nothing more than to have the hard-earned money they used to book the flight refunded back to their original method of payment. It's common sense that if the flight was cancelled by the airline, meaning that they could no longer provide the service that you had bought, then you have the right to request a full refund to the original method of payment. The airlines can offer you a flight in the future, of course, but you didn't buy a flight in the future. You bought a flight on the specific date that you had booked, which has now been cancelled, so naturally you're entitled to a full refund if you want one. But the airlines were not playing fair, withholding the money of customers, leaving them out of pocket for flights that would no longer be running, and adding insult to injury by offering them these 24-month travel vouchers that they didn't want. And this was happening to thousands of individuals and households all over Canada.
Between Air Transat and Sunwing, they have stolen $8,000 of my hard-earned money.
Has stolen my $1,500.
We paid Air Canada $3,528 for our international flights to come to Canada. they have not refunded our money.
These are just a handful of the ordinary people just like you and me in Canada and all around the world whose hard-earned money Canadian Airlines have been brazenly refusing to refund. But even though it's common sense to a reasonable person that airlines should be refunding people's money if the flights were cancelled, the real question is there a legal basis for these claims? Even though the airline's behavior is in bad taste, are they acting in contravention of the law?
If you are not able to travel because of the COVID-19 pandemics, you have a right for a refund.
This is Dr. Gabor Lukács, founder of the Air Passenger Rights Organization here in Canada, whose stated mission is to turn helpless passengers into empowered travelers through education, advocacy, investigation, and litigation. He explains exactly what obligates the airlines to refund people's money and why a 24-month travel credit is not enough.
When we talk about the right of passengers to a refund, I would like to spend just a few minutes talking about important documents called the airline tariffs. These are the terms and conditions of what is agreed between the passenger and the airline. It is very clear that there is a right to a refund, to the same form of payment. We have seen now the tariffs of the airlines, but that's not the only source for the rights of passengers. There are lots of case law that confirms that passengers have the right to a refund in the event of a cancellation of a flight.
As Dr. Lukács explains, the legal obligation for airlines to provide refunds on cancelled flights has its roots in two things. The first is the airline's tariff itself, which is basically the contract between the airline and the passenger that is established at the time of purchase, and which has always given passengers the right, in the event of a cancellation, to a full refund to the original form of payment if the alternative presented by the airline does not suit the traveler's needs. The key detail here is that the passenger has the right to choose. If they like what the airline is offering as an alternative, in this case the travel voucher with a 24-month validity, then they can take it. But if not, then it's time for the airline to refund the money. In addition, the other basis on which passengers are entitled to receive refunds is the Canadian case law. Previous cases against airlines have already established via legally binding rulings that if the airline cancels a flight, then no matter how much they wish to hold on to the money, they need to provide a full refund to the original method of payment if that is the customer's wish. So no matter how you slice it, morally, contractually, or legally, the airlines need to give customers their money back on the hundreds of flights that they've cancelled. And yet, this fiasco has dragged on for months and months since it began in March, and the airlines continue to hold the money that rightfully belongs to the Canadian traveling public. Let's stop here to ask ourselves why. The airline's viewpoint is ultimately pretty simple to understand. The global aviation industry has never dealt with a challenge like COVID-19 before. For many airlines around the world, it's a time of survival, conserving cash as much as possible in order to avoid bankruptcy. And the reality could very well be that if every Canadian airline doled out full refunds to every passenger that was entitled to one, then many of the airlines would run out of cash and liquidate. Essentially, sometime around the third week of March, all of Canada's airlines had realized that they had no choice but to adopt a collective hardline stance on refunds if they wished to survive the economic havoc that the pandemic was wreaking on the airline industry. And so the airline's position is that even though it would be reasonable to refund customers during normal times, the airlines should be granted some latitude right now, and that the tariffs and the case law, both of which were established before the pandemic, should hold less weight during these extraordinary times. That's their defense, at least. But needless to say, sympathy levels for the airlines among the general public have been lower than the legroom on board a Sunwing flight. And why shouldn't they be? During regular times, airlines are notorious for all sorts of customer-unfriendly policies, like cramming economy class passengers into tighter and tighter seats, and nickel and diming passengers for everything from onboard snacks to extra legroom. Why should the general public have sympathy for airlines when, at least on the surface, everything seems so tilted in their favor during normal times? To put this another way, if you had booked a non-refundable flight and needed to cancel it, would you expect the airline to refund you that non-refundable flight, even if you really badly needed the money and would go bankrupt without it? Of course not. Rules are rules, the airline would say. So why should passengers be okay with letting airlines keep the money when the tables are turned? Why should the airline's precarious financial situation take precedence over the thousands of Canadian households who might have been equally, if not more, financially disadvantaged by the pandemic? Ultimately, the airlines can act so brazenly against their obligations under the law for one reason and one reason alone. They know they'll get away with it. Sure, the tariff and the case law both require that they provide refunds, but enforcement of these requirements will likely take place in a court of law, and the wheels of justice turn slowly, especially during a pandemic. The airlines know that even if a class action lawsuit is filed and they're eventually ordered to give the money back in the form of refunds, they can hold on to the money for the time being, essentially using it as an interest-free loan from their customers to get them through this lean period. It may surprise you when I say that I don't really blame the airlines in all of this, because airlines will be airlines. They're corporations at the end of the day, and like any other corporation, they act only in the name of shareholder value. It would be unreasonable of us to expect anything else of corporations, after all. And so, my fellow Canadians, wouldn't this be the perfect time for, let's say, a government agency with powers of oversight to step in and, oversee the airline's behavior? Such an organization would be able to clear the air, no pun intended, and establish that travel vouchers are not at all a sufficient replacement for refunds, to demand that the airlines take action as quickly as possible and provide refunds where they are due, and to enforce this behavior by issuing fines to airlines that don't comply. Wouldn't that be nice? Oh wait, what's that? Oh, we do have an organization like that here in Canada? Oh right, it's the Canadian Transportation Agency. Cool, so let's see if they've said anything about the vouchers and the refunds, eh? Oh good, they have. Here's a statement on vouchers on the CTA website. On the one hand, passengers who have no prospect of completing their planned itineraries should not simply be out of pocket for the cost of cancelled flights, of course. On the other hand, airlines facing huge drops in passenger volumes and revenues should not be expected to take steps that could threaten their economic viability. The CTA believes that an appropriate approach in the current context could be for airlines to provide vouchers or credits for future travel, as long as these vouchers or credits do not expire in an unreasonably short period of time. 24 months would be considered reasonable in most cases. Wow. Just wow. For an organization with the mandate of providing consumer protection for air passengers, Canadian Transportation Agency, you've got some gall to be putting out a statement like this, effectively defending the airlines and turning your backs on Canadian air passengers when they needed you the most. It's important to note that as irresponsible as the CTA's statement of vouchers is, it is only that, a statement, a recommendation, somebody's opinion, and in no way a legally binding ruling. But of course, as soon as this statement was published, it gave the airlines further ammunition to mislead customers by telling them that the CTA supports the airlines in not providing refunds and that a travel credit is in fact sufficient. And the fact that the CTA chose to take this position is even more regrettable when you consider that its global peers in the US, Europe, Australia, and indeed most of the world have actually taken the correct stance that customers are owed refunds and have backed up their stance with the threat of enforcement action against their nation's airlines. That makes Canada one of the few countries around the world whose governmental transportation authority has basically hung customers out to dry. Like I said, airlines will be airlines at the end of the day. We already know to expect self-serving behavior from the airlines because after all, it's a highly competitive industry with very fine profit margins. But we as the Canadian traveling public certainly will have expected much better from the CTA, and if you ask me, most of the blame for why the refunds issue has dragged on for so long, with many Canadians still being owed thousands of dollars from the airlines, lies at the CTA's door. Dr. Gabor Lukács has been a busy man over the past few months. He has been involved in tireless efforts to help ordinary Canadians battle against the big airlines and fight for their money back. Even though the airlines almost always refuse to provide a refund when you ask them, consumers thankfully do have one more line of defense: their credit card protections, and in particular, the credit card chargeback feature. Here's Dr. Lukács describing the process.
Under the law, if a consumer doesn't receive the goods or services they had paid for, the credit card company has certain obligations, the credit card issuer more precisely. They are required to investigate, and they are required to reverse or cancel charges where the contract was canceled by the consumer because of non-delivery of services.
If you're seeking a refund from one of Canada's airlines for a flight that they canceled, a credit card chargeback is likely your best recourse. Make sure that you've documented your attempts to ask for a refund and given the airlines a reasonable period to respond. And if they say no, then after that, initiate the credit card chargeback on the basis that the good or service that you paid for, in this case your canceled flight, was never fulfilled. Some people who have pursued this avenue have been successful in getting their refund, but not everyone. The airlines are pretty inundated with these chargeback requests these days, so there's a pretty good chance that they won't be able to respond to your case in time, and you'll successfully claim the refund back on your credit card. Sometimes though, the airlines do end up disputing the chargeback, and if that's the case, then your only option to pursue a refund might be through the legal process, either at small claims court or by joining one of the 3 class action lawsuits here in Canada, and likely many more in the future, that have sprung up around this issue. Going forward, I'd like to see Canada's airlines do a better job at finding the balance between preserving their finances and doing what's right for the customer. I believe that this is the right course of action, even from a shareholder's perspective, considering the reputational damage that Canada's airlines have suffered due to the refunds issue both domestically and abroad. But ultimately, like I said, the blame for this fiasco has to fall squarely on the shoulders of the Canadian Transportation Agency, whose actions during this time have revealed them to be toothless at best or entrenched firmly in the airline's pockets at worst. When authorities in other countries did the right thing and stood up for passengers, the CTA stood with Canada's big airlines instead and hung ordinary Canadians out to dry. Whatever credibility the CTA had before has surely been lost. And even if they do end up reversing course on the refunds issue, after Canadians have been made to wait months and months for money that's rightfully theirs, the CTA will face a mountain to climb to regain that credibility among the Canadian traveling public.